So welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran.pedley. Delighted to be joined by Sir John Curtice today to go through the myriad of election results we had last week and to try and make sense of it all. John, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Not at all. Lovely to be with you, Keiran.
I think before we go into some of the detail of this, it'd be good just to get your overall top-line impressions of what we saw last week. Obviously, it's we're getting to the business end of this parliament, it's fair to say. General election on the horizon at some point. So what did we learn?
To be honest, I think we primarily got confirmation of what the opinion polls have been telling us, which is that not much has changed in the last 12 months, apart from the fact that Reform are somewhat more popular than they once were. Though I think what is true, and we could perhaps go into this, is that probably the impact of Reform on the Conservatives' current standing and how they emerged after those elections was probably underestimated by anything anybody said, simply because Reform only fought in 1 in 6 of the local authority wards. But I mean, people have kept on asking me, well, were there any surprises? And frankly, there weren't any surprises. Not even the West Midlands was a surprise. Anybody who looked at it would go, well, Conservatives might hang on to it, but equally they might not hang on to it. It always looked pretty much like a 50-50 shot. The one thing that we kind of knew a bit from polling, but local elections were able to give us much firmer evidence on, was the fact that people living in Muslim communities, and therefore, at least by implication, at least particularly people who identify as Muslim, though not necessarily exclusively them, that they have indeed, for the time being at least, wanted to register a protest with the Labour Party vis-a-vis its stance on Gaza. Support for the Labour Party fell quite heavily in wards with over 10% Muslim. It's about 14% as compared with 2021. So that is clearly an ongoing story, though how far it will continue to be a story through to the general election, of course, we'll have to see.
Yeah, just on that very briefly, regulars or viewers of this podcast will know that we have a sort of ongoing biannual tracker of ethnic minority voting behaviour and leader satisfaction ratings that we've done going back to 96, and we'll have the latest wave of that in the next couple of weeks, which I think should add to that story. But yeah, certainly not unexpected maybe, but it's always interesting to see it in real vote terms. On the Conservatives, obviously, I do want to talk about smaller parties, but the story does come back to the general election and what do we think is going to happen and so forth. Just how bad was last Thursday for the Conservatives?
Basically, more or less as bad as we might have anticipated. Colin Rallings and Michael Thrasher reckoned they might lose 500 seats if the polls were right. Well, they lost 470 odd. I had calculated that if the polls were roughly right, they might lose 10 of the Police and Crime Commissioner elections. They lost 11. I also reckoned that the Conservatives would register their worst result in terms of votes in the London Assembly election, and that also happened. So all of this, in a sense, was evidence that indeed, as the opinion polls have been saying, that they are in deep electoral trouble. And of course, the various projections of the local council results into saying, well, what would have happened if the whole country had had local elections on that day? And we assume that Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrat would have fought everywhere, and that people who didn't have local elections would have behaved in an analogous manner to those who did. Our calculation, and Sky's wasn't that dissimilar, was that basically the Conservatives were doing as badly as they've ever done, if not necessarily worse than they have previously done. So by all the measures that are available to us, the Conservatives were in a difficult situation. But there were two things underneath the bonnet that probably should give the Conservatives particular cause for reform. The one thing that there seemed to be a bit of a divergence in the polls was that, the Conservatives were down according to the various estimates of how the parties were doing in the local elections, and so also were Labour, which again wasn't miles out. But basically there wasn't really any swing at all between Conservative and Labour as compared with last year. However, if you look at the 1 in 6 wards where Reform stood, then you begin to see a crucial pattern and a crucial difference. So in the wards in which Reform stood, Conservative support as compared with 2019 was down by 19 points, as compared with, 11, 12 points in wards where they didn't stand. And the intriguing thing about that 19 points is it is exactly in line with the change in Conservative support in the average of the opinion polls in May 2021, which is the point of comparison here, and where they're at now. And secondly, what you then also see, if you do the comparison with last year, then you see the Conservatives doing particularly worse, down about 5 points or so in places where Reform fought for the first time, and they didn't fight last year. You then do see a swing to Labour, which is what you'd anticipate from the national opinion polls. And insofar as Reform stick to their guns and do decide to fight every parliamentary election seat, arguably it's what happened in those wards where Reform stood that perhaps is the real guide, and certainly what happened in those wards is almost exactly in line with what you'd expect from the opinion polls. So in other words, probably the big figures, including the big figure in terms of projected national share, probably underestimate how much damage was done to the Conservatives by Reform, and actually probably overestimates their overall standing. The other thing which emerges from these local elections, this is what opinion polls can't pick up unless you do a big MRP poll, but some of it is in there. But again, was in last year's local elections. Point one, the Conservative vote is falling most heavily in places where they were previously strongest. Point two, there is clear evidence of anti-Conservative tactical voting. Labour's best performances are in wards where they were starting off second to the Conservatives. The Democrats' best performances were in wards where they were starting off second to the Conservatives. And those two patterns spell potential disaster for the Conservatives when it comes to the outcome in terms of seats, and that it'd be even worse than whatever you might otherwise expect, giving their standing in terms of votes. And, for those of us who are old in the tooth, this is extraordinarily redolent, these two patterns of what we were seeing in local elections in 1995 and 1996. And we know what happened in 1997. The Conservatives came a cropper, and the outcome in terms of seats in particular was especially bad, down to 165, because of those two geographical patterns.
So I want to come on to, so you mentioned the mid-90s. I want to talk about projected national share. I know there's two versions of this that aren't often that dissimilar. I think the BBC one had Labour on 34 and the Conservatives 25. Is that right? Was that the 9-point lead, or have I got it the wrong way around?
We were the 9-point lead.
Yeah.
But basically there was very little difference between the two. We were actually closer than we often are.
Yeah. So there's obviously been, you'll be very aware, there's been a lot of consternation over the weekend about the suggestion that these local election results might point to a hung parliament. Indeed. Which my interpretation of is basically simply overlaying this projected national share onto a hypothetical House of Commons. Indeed. But I think there was follow-up commentary from Professor Michael Thrasher that sort of suggested, I think an article at the time suggested this might give Labour, pause for thought, or it might give you pause for thought if you think Labour are going to win big. I think I've got that right. So yeah, what do we... Is that what the local elections suggest? I mean, do we think we're heading for a hung parliament, or that Labour should be a bit more cautious than, or we should be a bit more cautious about the potential scale of a Labour victory?
Well, what I will simply say to you, Kieran, is that there was a good reason why the BBC didn't do the same thing with its projected national share. It's done so in the past. I've increasingly said, no, we shouldn't be doing this anymore. And finally, an editorial decision was made in advance of the results that we would not do it this year. So, I mean, and I speak as the person who kind of started this game way back in the early 1980s. Way back in the early 1980s, you could do it without really too much concern, because indeed the results of local elections, when you project it in that way, was pretty much in line with what you would expect from the national polls. But from the late 80s onwards, i.e. from around the point when the now Liberal Democrats were first formed, but they really, really fell in the polls because of the split between the Liberals and the SDP. The Liberal Democrats have done better in local elections. They have done in national opinion polls. That all got confirmed when we started having local elections and general elections on the same day from 1997 onwards. We discovered even on the same day people would vote differently in local elections. General elections, in particular, the Liberal Democrats doing better. More recently, the Greens have started doing better in local elections than they in their current national standing, and particularly in London. You can see in 2010, when we had coincident elections, the Greens doing better than they were doing when you added their votes up in parliamentary constituencies. And of course, independents are starting doing well. So, I mean, certainly one needs to realise that the relationship between the levels of support for the parties in local elections and their levels of support in opinion polls, they have become more divergent. What is true, however, and you'll see this in some of my remarks already, is that the changes in support for the parties, they're not in exact they're not a mirror image. They tend to move in parallel, right? They're not always in perfect parallel. In other words, if the party's gone up in the polls since the last local elections, they tend to go up in the local elections and vice versa, okay? So I think you should be focusing on change on levels. So point one is, there are reasons why I'm now, I mean, other than doing the Peter Snow thing of, this is a bit of fun, but don't really take too much notice of it, but to suggest that this is now what we might think these local elections mean, I'm wary. So I'm wary for that reason. There's an issue. I mean, the other thing which is true, and it's also true of these projected national shares. I mean, with projected national shares, frankly, Scotland still doesn't matter very much because it's such a small proportion of the country, and the SNP is only around 3 or 4% of the vote. But again, I was reflecting on this in light of the whole row. This is probably the first time when any projection you do, you can't ignore Scotland. So until the 2015 general election, I mean, the SNP never got more than 6 seats in Scotland. So, frankly, you ignored it, right? But then the rise in SNP support before the 2015 election occurred after the 2014 local elections, and the 2015 election happened on the same day. Then, even last year, the fall in the SNP had begun to be in evidence, but, again, it's kind of fairly recent. This is really the first year where something has happened in Scotland where, you might want to add 20 seats to anything you do off the back of the projected national share. So Scotland's got more complicated for the first time. But then also, when you're going to project it in terms of seats, it's those geographical patterns that I've already referred to, which, if they happen in a general election, and I think there's good reason to believe that at the moment, at least they would, though I think they are conditional on the unpopularity of the Conservative Party at the moment, then again, the outcome in terms of seats would not necessarily reflect what is basically, a projection based on a uniform national movement. I mean, I think at the moment, one's expectation would be that the electoral geography of party support in current circumstances will move in Labour's favour. That's what the MRP polling tells you as well. So for all those reasons, I kind of go, well, that's why I'm happy that we decided not to do it. I understand why the Prime Minister seized on it, because, of course, this is an old Conservative
that's politics,
tune.
Isn't it? Of course,
Well, yeah, and the Conservatives believe that in the 2015 election, one of the reasons why they got an overall majority is because they persuaded people that we were heading for a hung parliament in which Labour would be in hock to the SNP, and tried to persuade voters in England this was a bad idea. Now, frankly, the data analysis I did back at the time using the British election study, I went, case not proven. And I'm not sure it's true. But they believe it's true. So, lo and behold, the old war cry turns out. So that's why the Prime Minister seized on it. But shall we say, I think there is a risk that it is a thin reed upon which to rest your hopes, as the outcome in West Midlands proved to be.
Yeah. So final question, which I have in 2 parts, really is about smaller parties, because, of course, the focus is on the Labour Conservative battle, because that influences who's going to be a number 10. But obviously, if we're talking about our political environment more generally, then the smaller parties are obviously very important related to that too. So two parts to this. One on reform, very briefly. So you mentioned that obviously the Conservatives suffered greatly in areas where reform stood. Is that factored into the PNS where the Conservatives are on 25, or would that have been maybe lower if reform had stood anywhere? That's a brief one.
Yeah. As I've already said to you, I think if the reform had fought everywhere, then the PNS might well have been lower. So
you've not made assumptions based on.
Well, no. I'm happy to make an analytic point and to suggest what its implications might be, but to put out on air as a headline, we are going to change the projection on the basis of what happened in 1/6 of the wards. That's a step too far.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, and then I guess more generally,
but what I would say to Kieran, right, is the level of support for others in general, right? So that is Reform and the Greens, who are responsible for about half of this, and also Independents. On our projected share, it's up to 24 points. It's almost back up to the level that it was back in 2019, which was, of course, around the time when both the Conservatives and Labour were unpopular in the polls. And a few weeks later, the Brexit Party came first and the Liberal Democrats came second in the European elections. So certainly at local government level, the fracturing of party support, it's not that the performance is ignored, it's just that we're not making special allowance for it. The smaller parties are as big a news as they have been in local elections during the course of the last, collectively for the last 5 years. And again, to anticipate your next point, the Greens were running on average at about 12 points in wards where they were running. They were up on both last year and on 2021. They're also up, albeit only marginally, on 2019. And hitherto, certainly for the last, post their particular spectacular performance in the 1989 European elections, I think this is their best local election performance for quite a while. And again, it underlines the evidence of the opinion polls, because you're right, we're all focusing on that Conservative lead over Labour, and we're ignoring the fact that about 1 in 3 voters are going none of the above. It's partly the Liberal Democrats, although the Liberal Democrats are not doing particularly well, but the Greens have been running at a record level. Reform are now running at around 12 or 13 points. Although the SNP are having a certain amount of trouble, they're still major players in Scotland. So we are somewhat ignoring the fracturing of the party system, which in terms of local elections at least, is kind of back to where we were in 2019. And equally, I then say also, Reform also running at about 12%. Not that many places where they were fighting also last year, but again, clearly up on last year. And again, I think, there's a debate in the community, and you can see some evidence in the mayoral polling of still there perhaps being a risk of Reform being overestimated in the polls. But the story about them going up, that's very clearly confirmed by these local elections.
John Curtice, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
So that was Sir John Curtice. Once again, big thanks to John for joining us and giving us his analysis on this podcast. I am joined by two of my favourite people to talk about politics with, Holly.day and Cameron.Garrett. Guys, welcome.
Hello, Kieran. Nice
we
to
got the
see
band
you
back together.
away from the TV.
Quite. Thank you in particular, Cameron, for you showing your face. It's very much appreciated. So I want to talk about the bits we didn't talk about with John, really, but it'd be good to get both of your sort of snap reactions, hot takes to what John's just said. So, Holly, maybe you go first. What stood out to you from what John said?
I think a particularly excellent part for us is that he said it's a confirmation of what the opinion polls have been telling us. So from a personal and professional perspective, good job, guys. We're doing well there.
Immediate sigh of relief.
Seal of approval from John Curtice, and everyone
if he'd
can
said
breathe.
anything different. So.
Everyone can exhale again after 4 days of absolute election carnage in our lives. I think the key point I picked up on, and it was something I think we discussed last week, Kieran, when we were talking about our early reflections, was the impact of Reform. Obviously, in the seats where they were standing, which was only about 1 in 6 across the country, they were taking a hefty chunk of particularly Conservative 2019 support. But given they only stood in 1 of 6 seats across the local council elections, obviously the impact is potentially slightly understated as to what it would be if it were translated into a general election campaign. So that's certainly something that's going to be interesting in the weeks and months to come, as we're moving towards a general election. If they can replicate what they did in the local elections in the places where they stood, across the whole of the UK, if they do indeed put out candidates everywhere, then the vote share that we're seeing across the opinion polls could start translating into actual seats. And it looks like it would be harming the Conservative Party rather than anyone else if that were to happen.
Yeah, I think given the intense scrutiny on the projected national share and what that means for hung parliaments or otherwise, the fact that it's potentially, dare I say, overstating the Conservatives and therefore maybe understating the gap between Labour and the Conservatives feels pretty significant. Cameron, you're arriving at this late, I suppose. Not sure how to put it. What did you make of it all?
Holly has stolen my most important point from John Curtice, so maybe I'll just hammer home that I think it is a very important point, and the fact that reform weren't standing does make it hard to read across. And if Thursday was kind of a bad set of result for the Conservatives, I think that points towards it potentially could be worse in the future, especially if it is coupled with the evidence of that tactical voting we've seen. And obviously there is still that unknown looming over with reform about Nigel Farage. Where does he come into this? I was reading in the Sunday Times that he might potentially want to stand in Clacton, and if he's in Parliament, etc., how would that play out? So yeah, I think that really is the most important point when we're trying to extrapolate from what happened on Thursday to what could happen later in the year.
It's not an important point necessarily for now, but I do think we should register in our minds the performance of the Greens. I mean, I think like at the moment, because they don't really have any obvious impact on Labour's chances of winning, or at least that might even be a stretch, to be fair. But like at the moment, we're not looking at the Greens as closely as we're looking at reform, because there's very much a tangible sense that reform could hurt the Conservatives or cost them power, or really, sort of put the exclamation mark on any defeat they have. Whereas, like, you can imagine next Parliament, let's say, if there is a Labour government, that a similar vibe or a similar dynamic could be happening with Labour, where Greens are taking lots of votes off Labour, and that's what means Labour's behind in the polls, etc. So it's not the most important thing now, maybe, but I think they're building up this foundation of councillors and support in different areas of the country that we shouldn't ignore. Anyway, Holly, there were, as our resident northern correspondent, by virtue of living further north than me and Cameron, and your expertise, obviously, there were lots of Metro mayors, weren't there, on a serious note last week? So we didn't talk about that with John. What did we learn from some of that?
Yeah, I remember saying on Friday morning when we had our Blackpool South by-election snap podcast that I was saying I was very excited about the days to come, about the mayoral elections. And I continued to be excited across the whole weekend. But there were some really, really striking results, I thought. There were 11 mayoralties up for grabs over the course of the weekend, and Labour now hold 10 of them out of the 11, including 3 women, which I thought was quite good. There are now female mayors in the East Midlands, West Midlands and the North East. And I think the big one that everyone was waiting for, that I think was close, that was the one that was close, that people were saying was a bit too close to call, was the West Midlands. And that one came out Saturday afternoon, and incumbent Conservative Mayor Andy Street lost by, I think it was 0.3% to Richard Parker of the Labour Party. And I think that's the one that we were kind of told by Conservative commentators at the start of the weekend, that if they won that, it was going to be a good weekend, and that they were going to be able to hang their hat on that result, as well as Ben Houchen's win that came earlier in the day. The fact that they lost that one, and by such a small margin, the moment of the recount being called in Coventry was wild. At about 4 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. Not least because my sister lives in Coventry. I messaged her and she didn't care at all. Neither did anyone else I was talking to. But as soon as mumbling started to come out about it being about the Conservative camp calling for that recount, I think people knew the direction of travel. And given the talk over the past couple of weeks about Andy Street's personal brand, the incumbency effect, the things that he's been doing across the West Midlands, the hope from the Conservative side was that would drag him over the line. And unfortunately for him and the Conservative Party, it didn't in the end. And that now means that Labour control, as I said, 10 of the 11 mayoralties across the country, including big vote shares for the likes of Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Tracy Brabin across the north. And also some of those newly elected mayorals that we saw in the East Midlands, where Kim McGuinness won, and also the election that in York and North Yorkshire, which is Rishi Sunak's home patch. So I think that's another one that Labour were hopeful that they'd win, and they got it over the line in the end. So a pretty positive story for the Labour Party about the mayoralties. I think the Conservative story that they were hoping to be able to talk about didn't quite materialise, although the Ben Houchen win was still pretty convincing.
Yeah, it was a strange one because we started off Saturday a bit dubious about what was going to happen in London, and then ended Saturday with the West Midlands being lost by the Tories. So it was something of a Saturday went pretty badly for Rishi Sunak, I think. I want to finish off with both of you getting your views on what it all means, and maybe I'll throw my tuppence in too. But Cameron, London, slightly strange Friday evening. You probably weren't. I don't know how closely you were paying attention to that, but where there was a suggestion it might be really close. In the end, I believe Sadiq Khan won by 11 points. So
I was at a wedding. I was at a wedding on Friday, Keiran, and as I was sitting down for the wedding dinner, I got a text from a friend saying, "Cameron, is it true Sadiq Khan has lost?" And I just jumped up and ran to the loo and was frantically on Twitter. And then I was like, oh, they're just all on statue.
Hopefully that wasn't during an important part of the wedding, like the first dance or the speeches, and you just jump up and leg it. If there is anyone now who
but yeah, in the end, quite a convincing win, pointed towards, some polls had that more or less spot on, won a third term, unprecedented. And obviously in the polling we did in the build up to the campaign, we did see Londoners were generally critical of his performance on crime, housing, ULEZ, etc. He got a -2 favourability rating. But Susan Hall did have more unknowns, and her favourability rating was -18. So it might be a choice of the candidate there. If there was a more better known, appealing candidate, maybe they could have give Sadiq a better run for his money.
Yeah, I think 11 points is not necessarily what you would expect a generic Labour candidate to win by, right, in the city at the moment. So I think there is a strange phenomenon in politics lately, and I think someone that follows American politics closely, that you see it a bit there, where results come in over several days, narratives form that then shape how the end result is actually shown. So, for example, because it was seen as, or maybe Sadiq Khan will lose, the fact that he won by 11 points was seen as, actually, it was a very good, comfortable victory. And it was a swing. It was a swing from the first round against Sean Bailey in 2021. But then I suppose the different electoral systems being different, I don't know how much you can measure them as the same thing. Just because obviously those Lib Dems and Greens that might have given their second preference to Sadiq Khan last time would have known, well, some of them would have known to give it first preference. So is that a swing, or is that just you sort of behaving and it's a change of electoral system? So yeah, I mean, I think it was a narrower victory than a typical generic Labour candidate might expect, but at the same time he's going for a third term. So inevitably when you're going for a third term, you're going to have decisions that people hold against you. Let's do a couple of minutes on what this all means, I suppose. We're assuming, I think, unless anyone disagrees, that the election's now in the autumn. Doesn't seem like the platform for which Rishi Sunak will call one. But maybe I'll go to Holly and Cameron in that order again. What do you think it all means? Where do we go from here, Holly?
I think moving towards the general election and looking at these local elections across England and Wales, where we saw the Conservative vote drop most heavily was in wards that they were trying to defend. And particularly, and I know John Curtice and others have mentioned this over the weekend, the tactical vote that seemed to come out across the country was quite an interesting one that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. So in places where the Conservatives were defending and Lib Dems were in second place, we saw like the Labour vote drop off while the Lib Dem vote increased, and vice versa. So where Labour were second place, the Lib Dem vote dropped off and the Labour vote share increased. So if those two parties and other smaller parties look to work together in that way, either intentionally or unintentionally, towards a general election in places where Conservatives are defending, well, given the swings that we've seen in recent by-elections, a reasonable margin or even a decent margin, if those coalitions start to come together and come out in force, if I were a Conservative MP at this point, with defending not a massive margin, that would worry me from the votes that we saw come out this weekend.
If you're defending a modest margin as a Conservative MP, you've probably stood down already at the moment. But anyway, Cameron, what do you make of some of that?
Picking up from what Holly said and your conversation with John Curtice, the line that the Conservatives have come out with, that it's potentially going to be a hung parliament, etc., and read into that and believe what you will. I question the extent to which that is actually a good line for the Conservatives to take. I imagine Labour aren't too unhappy with it. Oh yeah, it could be a hung parliament, so if you are really dissatisfied with the Conservatives, you actually do need to get out and vote for us. And we are seeing this widespread dissatisfaction. And yeah, they basically don't want voters to get complacent, and this could be a good thing to create voter enthusiasm to actually get out to the ballot boxes come a general election.
There's a couple of quick points I'd add to that. I think I agree with both of what you're saying. I think that the reform dynamic, which I think you both, well, Holly touched on, you were going to touch on, Cameron, is important. I keep banging this drum, but I think if Nigel Farage does make a full frontal, comeback. I
didn't know where you were going with that then.
Full frontal.
Yeah, I was hoping you weren't going to notice.
What would that do to the polls?
Yes, there's some puns you could throw in there, which I'm not going to.
No.
But stop saying but. So I think if he makes a comeback and leads reform, that has the potential to obviously be a bit of a game changer in a game that's not going the Conservatives' way. And I think you'd also sort of say, look, we had the podcast last week with Kezia Dugdale on Scotland, which I keep plugging, but I do think even now. John Swinney's become the SNP leader, but even now, still relevant to go and get Kezia's opinions on what Labour does there and what Labour might do in office in Westminster to try and help solidify the union and things of that nature. Because politics is about more than just an election. We're all focused on the general election. That's what we do. But actually, politics is an ongoing thing, right? Where it doesn't stop just because that election happens. So I do think, but more importantly for the next election, clearly what happens in Scotland, and John was saying it on the podcast today, is really, really important too. So there's those dynamics that are sort of additional bits of information that maybe we either don't have at the moment or aren't forefront of the narrative because everyone's focusing on these projected shares. What are the is there going to be a hung parliament, this sort of stuff. But the reform and SNP dynamic to this is so critical. So we need to keep an eye out on that. But let's leave it there for now. Big thanks as ever to Holly.day and Cameron.Garrett for joining me and everyone to listening and watching. If you like what you hear /see, please do subscribe, tell a friend about us, tell people you don't even like about us. Just tell people, just to stop people in the street randomly and tell them about the podcast. And that's it. Thanks for listening.